We come to the second presentation, and what we're doing is accumulating resonances that will form a set once we establish a harmonic that has a keying chord that will not only integrate but allow for creative play within that set. In ancient times, in order to deal with the existential body, after our kind had slipped out of the natural rhythms and natural cycles enough so that we were no longer in kilter, we were out of kilter. In the northern part of India was developed a technique of yoga. The word yoga comes from an Indo-European root that English preserves in yolk, as in the egg yolk, or the yoke that goes over the oxen or the pair of oxen to plow the fields. A yoga was the yoke of the body to reveal the yolk of the egg of our true being. This was established many thousands of years ago. We have since fallen out of, not only out of kilter of the natural cycle, we have fallen out of kilter of the conscious ecology. And so in our time, there had to be developed a yoga of civilization to bring back the technique of harnessing capacities for life, for nourishment, and a technique to reveal the meaning core of our lives and of our capacities, of our future developments, of our present crisis, of our past heritage. The yoga of civilization was developed over 42 years and came out finally as the learning civilization. The last cycle of this was 2006-07 with an exit of one season, 3 months in 2008. These lecture series from 2008 and 2009 are follow-ups to develop some of the thematic cores of meaning, but to also allow for the expansion of the yoga of civilization developed in that program over 42 years to be able to yoke problems that were intractable before and to reveal yokes that were not accessible before. One of the watermarks is the difference between the purposes of symbols and of science. This is from my notes for today. I always put the notes together, and I just recently have begun to issue them in book form. Symbols orient us to the universe. Science orients us to our cosmos. It is a different emphasis. The universe is an idea of the integral whole of the completed natural cycle that finds its completion in our symbolic form of thought arranged so that it understands completely. One can have an idea of the universe, and the strongest way to express it is the nature of the universe. Now, when I was 14, this little Mentor paperback was issued in January of 1955. It was a reprint of a book published in 1950 by one of the world's great astronomers at the time, Fred Hoyle. And I remember reading this at 14, and it shifted my perspective because I came to realize through this little paper bound that the science fiction that I had been reading since I learned to read in World War II, I learned to read around 1944. I had read big little books, I had read comic books, I had read science fiction books out of libraries like Rocket Ship Galileo by Robert Heinlein and so forth. And I begun to buy hardcovers, the Winston science fiction series. They were $2 each. And I remember working for my dad in order to save up enough to maybe once every couple of weeks go and buy a book. This paperbound showed me that there were interesting things in paperback science fiction. So this was like a trigger and a key. It has only about 120-some pages with a sheaf of photographs at the time. This was new to have a popular look at the nature of the universe. But the final little couple of paragraphs are extremely important for us now in 2009 for this particular series, Quintessential Dimensions of Consciousness. The 7th little chapter is a personal view, looking to the future. I come now to an entirely different class of question, with the clear understanding that what I am now going to say has no agreed basis among scientists, but represents my own personal views. I shall try to sum up the general philosophic issues that seem to me to come out of our survey of the universe. It is my view that man's unguided imagination could never have chanced on such a structure as I have put before you. No literary genius could have invented a story 1/100th part as fantastic as the sober facts that have been unearthed by astronomical science. This is by the late 40s. You need only compare our inquiry into the nature of the universe with the tales of such acknowledged masters as Jules Verne and H.G. Wells to see that fact outweighs fiction by an enormous margin. One is naturally led to wonder what the impact of the new cosmology would have been on a man like Newton, who would have been able to take it in, details and all, in one clean sweep. I think that Newton would have been quite unprepared for such a revelation, and that it would have had a shattering effect on him. And then he goes on to make the point that we must take our time for epical threshold realizations to impact not only us and our views, but the entire world of mankind as a species, the entire Earth as a planet, the entire future of the star system in among trillions of other star systems in the cosmos. Untold trillions, actually. We have not only had blinders, we have had cataracts within the blinders. This material is able to remove the cataracts and the blinders. But a phenomenon occurs first expressed by Plato in his great long dialogue, The Republic, in what is known in Book 10 as the section of the myth of the cave. That when human beings, man, think they know something, they don't realize until it is slowly worked out that we are seated on benches facing a wall of the cave, and that behind us is a fire, and that certain cutout forms are held by mysterious figures and passed before the fire, throwing shadows on the wall of the cave that we are watching. And we are chained to those benches. This is Plato 2,400 years ago, folks. Occasionally, someone with incredible strength or incredible finesse will be able to get out from those chains and turn around and see that one has been looking at shadows of cut out things held by mysterious beings before a fire that certainly lights the cave, but that far off there is a brilliant light of the opening of the cave outside into the sunlight. Such a person, Plato writes, will with great adventure and courage go past the fire out towards the light, but emerging from the cave that he has been raised in, or she has been raised in all her life, and everyone she knows has, the blinding light is intolerable as a glare, as a radiation that is fearful, and almost all will go back down the tunnel into the cave and sit down on the benches and drape the chains and say no more. It is very rare until one learns how to learn. You must be patient and paced like a yoga to emerge long enough to acclimate yourself to the radiance of reality. It takes a while, not just for it to sink in, but to penetrate, because in its penetration in comes a conscious response to the natural penetration in, to the conscious penetration out. When someone is able to recognize that their consciousness is now a dimension of the light of nature, that what alchemically was called the light of lights, there is natural light, lumen de natura, but there's lumen de lumen. The ordinal light of lights, which is consciousness, and when it achieves that acclimation of the two penetrations weaving together, a whole new field is realized. It is no longer just the field of nature, but that consciousness itself has a field, and that the field of consciousness is infinite. So that in weaving the field of consciousness with the field of nature, one is able to weave in threads, themes, vectors, tensors, many other expressions that are full of possibilities and transforms. and that nature as a field accepts this weaving on all levels, in all ways. But what occurs then is that the emergence out of nature of existence is changed. It's no longer just a rote, ritual emergence, but it is a charged existence that has possibilities and developments. And one of the clearest ways to express this, so that one can form an initial idea, the emergence of existential forms out of nature is because those forms are unified by a polarity that cinches itself as electromagnetic energy. In the field of nature, it was not energy. It was a plasma that no longer had the cinching polarity of integral. It was a plasma that really swirled in and out of a 0 approaching 1, a 1 approaching 0, and in this ping pong game, neither the 1 nor any other integral was really there. It was simply an allness that was not integral, but was potential. It's only the polarity cinching of charge that allows for particality to occur and to cinch and to remain. What is the lifetime of an electron? What is the lifetime of a proton? Though our universe, just even on that level, has been around for almost 14 billion years, they are still there. And what is peculiar is that particality likes to come out paired. And when they are paired, they have a peculiar quality of having pairs of pairs, where not only are electrons then paired with anti-electrons, which are called positrons, but the holes of electrons are paired with the holes of positrons. And one begins to see, just in charge itself, that there is a mighty mystery to be understood. But when consciousness as a dimension, as a fifth dimension, as a quintessential dimension is added to space-time, not only is there charge in the universe, in the cosmos now, because consciousness has come to be dimensional, but chirality has come into play. A left-handedness and a right-handedness come into play, so that the forms that are there, the particality that is there, has spin. And now spin has, through its right or left-handed chirality, augments charge, so that one now has an emphasis not just on the electromagnetic forces, but there is also a magneto-electric spectrum as well. And later on in this series, we will come to see that there is a third quality that comes into play with a second transform of consciousness, and that third is not charge, it's not spin. It is so not just a mystery, but mysterious, that it's called strangeness. That's what it's called. The first transform is by consciousness as a fifth dimension. That produces a chirality in the world. So that if one is going to be conscious about a balance, a symmetry of chirality of right or left-handed was always the sign of the earliest form of prayer. It's called the Oran's mudra. And if one stretches it to its limit, it comes out like this. And 2,000 years ago, this was the mudra of the infinite, unlimited expansion of not only a conscious space-time, but adding other dimensions that now come into play. And one of them, like the quintessential dimension of differential conscious vision, is itself a process that comes out of that field, and that process is history. And what history shows is that there is a new way to take the chirality of vision, prismed through the dimension of a new form, an art form, and that the art forms are always created by artists. So that the first art form created is the beginnings of the art of person making. And that the art of person making is not based on a calibration of a politic, but is formed on the creative basis of an aesthetic. So that there is not only an art of person making, who then it becomes an artist who is able to make art, to make architecture, to make poetry, to make music, dance. But they are prismatic, whereas existential forms are pragmatic. They must do in limited sequences so that the electromagnetic polarity is utilized and made to work in this way in a symmetry of space-time. But when you add consciousness now, the symmetry is revealed in a new way. And that is that molecular structures and atoms as atomic structures are capable of being stable only when they have a rotational symmetry. It is the rotational symmetry that allows for the dynamis to emerge as energy, not just once, but iteratively, many thousands of times per time unit, so that we call it no longer just an iteration, but we call it a vibration. And that all energy will have a vibratory frequency at which it registers in its stability in terms of forms that have emerged and now are not only stable electromagnetically, but they are stable in terms of rotational chirality as well. And we will come to see in a deeper way that the radiance that accompanies the emergence with the rotational chirality, the charge and the chirality together in a complementarity, allows for that third symmetry of strangeness to not emerge as like a third pairedness, but to be disclosed to the discloser that this was there all the time. And so we're looking at something which is not only a mystery, but is mysterious. But our capacities to be mysterious are going to accumulate so that we are able to see in that light. So symbols orient us to the universe, but science orients us to the cosmos. The difference between the nature of the universe and the theoretical field of science is that consciousness as an ecology is able to weave, is able to come into an interpenetrative way with the field of nature. The deepest way to understand is to understand that nature as a field registers as a pair to the integral unity of existence. Each particle of existence will have its integral. And when the integrals come together on increasing levels of complexity, they are always integral. But they're integral in terms of a vibration, of a vibratory coupling, as it used to be expressed about 40 years ago in nuclear expressions. The vibratory, the vibronic coupling, that all energy has its frequency that registers exactly as that, and that one can count on the fact that an electron is 1,846 times smaller than a proton in terms of energy registration. Now, the electron, as we said last week, reminding us, was first discovered by J.J. Thomson in 1896. The development of the whole notion that there is a proton is due to Ernest Rutherford. Now, it's interesting because Rutherford, born in New Zealand, as we said, he worked on New Zealand farms until he was 23. He was digging potatoes in a field. His father had worked as a flax farmer, but he had proven to be rather a genius. And his mother came out to the potato field and said, the man who was selected to go to the University of Cambridge in England under a special program in the British Empire decided to get married. He cannot go. He will not go. If you'd like to, you could go. And so he went to the Cavendish laboratory at the University of Cambridge, headed up by J.J. Thomson. This is how the mystery works. Thomson was one of the world's great theoretical geniuses, absolutely brilliant all his life. He was all thumbs when it came to equipment. He would break things. So they would always surround him and assure him that they were reading his notes, listening to his lectures, following his theoretical genius. Please don't touch the equipment. Rutherford was a genius with equipment. The only man of the time who was better, perhaps, than Rutherford was Enrico Fermi, who built all of his own equipment in northern Italy. Rutherford began to do the same. And so Thomson, because Rutherford was building the equipment, took him into special confidence that this is how you're able to realize. And part of the realization was that Thomson, being a very quiet, hermetic figure, was able to reveal to Rutherford that there is a long history of the science of transform. It is the Hermetic tradition. And one aspect of it is alchemy. So that when Rutherford gave his last, as it turned out, the last lecture of his life, and it was published, that was in November 1936, it's called The Newer Alchemy. But more telling than that, in 1931, by that time, Rutherford had become one of the world's great scientists, one of the greatest of all time. He was knighted and he was given a chance to design a coat of arms in 1931. And in the coat of arms, at the top is the kiwi bird. On one side is a Maori warrior. Rutherford could dance the Maori dances. He once threatened somebody who was trying to rough up his budget. He said, "I know how to do the Maori war dance." On the other side of a shield that has the two curves that are part of the trajectories that one gets when a nucleus of the atom theoretically would be able to be split. And on the far side is Hermes Trismegistus, the great Hermetic master of teaching, like a Prometheus, teaching man the creative fire of transform that applies to all of the aspects of nature, including atoms. Rutherford, because he was treated so beautifully by J.J. Thomson, loved to have young men treated the same way by him. And he became famous for the fact that if you worked with Rutherford, you got to not only do hands-on, but you got to do hands-on in such a way that your mistakes were not mistakes. They were the way that the steps of learning take place into the unknown. If you already knew, you wouldn't have to make the equipment and do this experiment. We're doing it because we don't know, and so the way forward are the steps of the mistakes. And so Papa Rutherford found many young men and one young woman when he went to his first big teaching assignment. He went to McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And out of his first 7 or 8 students, one was a woman, and Harriet Brooks. She didn't go on, though she was a genius at this, because she also got married. Rutherford finally got enough salary that he hopped back to New Zealand to marry his grade school love, and her name was Mary Newton, but because her mother had the same name, everybody called her May. So he brought May back. But he met in 1911 his most extraordinary student. Like Rutherford was the most extraordinary student of J.J. Thomson, Niels Bohr was the most extraordinary student of Lord Rutherford as he came to be. His first name was Ernest, but no one ever called him Ernest. Everyone called him Ern, because he was always the mechanically adept teacher who cared for you, who sheltered you, who nourished you. So Lord Rutherford was really Ern. What is interesting about Niels Bohr is that he got the magnetic lineage passed on to him, so that Niels Bohr became famous throughout the world because his Institute of Theoretical Physics in Copenhagen drew the genius young men, the superlative genius young men from around the world to come and not only study with him, to work with him, but to become sons to him. Niels Bohr had 4 sons of his own, his beautiful wife of a lifetime, Marguerite. but there were several dozen young men who also became sons to Niels Bohr. It was Bohr who finally, after several decades, almost 3 decades of world-class work, came to be invited to the United States at the beginning of 1939. When we come to volume 1 of 10 of the collected works of Niels Bohr, we get an insight into something which is extraordinary here. Here's a nice little photograph of Papa Bohr. These are men who loved the young men to come up and do better than they had done. Climb over my achievements on your own work. I will boost you. I will encourage you. Here is something extraordinary. They had discovered a peculiarity of uranium, that a certain isotope of uranium was different from the normal uranium, which in order to split the nucleus of ordinary uranium takes an immense amount of energy, almost astronomical. But paradoxically, Niels Bohr and a really close friend of his who welcomed him to the United States, John A. Wheeler, who was the great master at Princeton. He was the mentor, like J.J. Thomson was the mentor of Rutherford, and Rutherford of Bohr, and Bohr then of dozens of others like Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Pauli, etc. John A. Wheeler was the mentor of Richard Feynman. So you have men who understand that the ecology of consciousness is a spirit family concern, and one passes on, like in the Hermetic tradition, from father to son, from father to daughter. That this is the way. We're going to take a little break, but I just want to start this. If you take a slow neutron and introduce it to the isotope of uranium, regular uranium is U-238, the isotope is U-235, very rare. You have to refine much of U-238, which is difficult to find in itself, to be able to get 235. The compound nucleus formed by the capture of the neutron has so little stability that it can split into 2 fragments about the same mass and charge. It was Hahn and Strassman's chemical identification of such fragments as decay products of uranium under neutron bombardment that suggested to Frisch and his aunt, Lisa Meitner, the fission mechanism as the only conceivable interpretation. We're going to take a break and then we'll come back. But it was Max Frisch and Lisa Meitner, nephew and aunt, who first understood, theoretically, saw the math, saw the results. They were the first ones to realize you can split an atom and release energy. And the energy that is released includes other neutrons, and that what is then the iteration pace? What is the vibratory pace of such a release? And when we come back from the break, we will get the answer. Let's take that break. Let's come back to an understanding that we have Symbols and science sum up. Symbols give us a way to integral the natural cycle. And one of the most powerful ideas of that is that there is a universe. And I was showing the first edition of a little Mentor paperbound, published January 1955, The Nature of the Universe, by the great Fred Hoyle, one of the great astronomers of that era. It is only 35 years later that you get a book called The Conscious Universe. Minas Kafatos and Robert Nadeau, part and whole in modern physical theory. There are only 35 years in between these two. The nature of the universe amended to the conscious universe. But what is here 20 years after this, some 55 years after this, is a different understanding. It is not different so much in kind, but different in scalar. As symbols give us an orientation in the universe, consciousness gives us an orientation in the cosmos. Better styled is not the cosmos, but our cosmos. We're trying to understand with a symbolic mind that looks for its referentiality to existence and experience and essence, that considered nature itself essential in terms that the symbolic essential understood it. But we're looking at a transformational scalar that has a fifth essence, like the movable thumb able to change the fingers into a hand. Not only into a hand, but into a pair of hands. And we talked before the break about how all existentials, all particles, all complexities of aggregating particles, whether an atom or a molecule or a cell, an individual, the universe, all belong to an integral, not just a cycle, but it has a completeness that includes a self-identification that is self-certifying in the sense that one can have a certainty. All of that has been challenged a number of times. And one of the big challenges that we talked about was in ancient times, almost long enough to be called archaic times. If you fell out of kilter with the natural cycle, there were techniques that were able to be applied that eventually came to be called, in the Indo-European languages some 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the root of the word yoga, which also in English has a connecting with the word for yoke. The essence, the fertile essence of the center is related to the transform that allows for the restoration of the natural cycle by doing two things at once. It purifies in the sense of being able to tune yourself energetically to the context that you occur in. Your body, with your posture, with your actions and karma, with all of it together in a Raja Yoga way. But there is a complementarity that is going on at the same time, and that is, while the yoga is yoking out into harmony, there is a yoke that is being disclosed within. This double quality is as refined as you can possibly expect in terms of the natural cycle. When you add a fifth essence, a quintessence of consciousness to space-time, now you can fall out of kilter of a five-dimensional structure, which continues its complexity because a sixth-dimensional prismatic spirit person emerges from this five-dimensional double field weaving the fabric of conscious space-time as a complex field, allows for the emergence of a transformer. Not just that transformation is possible, even that the scalar is that transformations are infinitely possible. It's not the integral of that, but is the prism of that that makes the spirit person. So that the spirit person becomes like a six-dimensional form, and like a jewel is able to be taken in its natural occurrence and cut in such a way as to disclose the radiance of the facetedness of the jewel. The first use of that as a metaphor, as a simile, was 2,000 years ago. And the writer who first used that was Philo of Alexandria. He said that what cuts the jewel of the person, he used the ancient Greek word logos. The logos is the cutter. He or she who knows how to use the logos, Philo says 2,000 years ago, is able now to cut a new kind of person. A person who most certainly is a refinement in nature, but who has as well a harmonic with the universe that increasingly discloses to them that the universe recognizes him, recognizes her. That now there is a different kind of a yoke that has been revealed, and a different kind of a yoga. And I showed, most of you are familiar with my work for over 42 years to make the Learning Civilization program. And in that, history is the operative seven-dimensional flow within the quintessential five-dimensional infinite field of differential consciousness, so that one has, instead of just the stream of experience within the field of nature coming out because of one's actions, one's existence, culminating in one's essence, in one's understanding, one's symbol thought. Now you have one who is prismatic, jewel-like, who has a quality of radiance, but also has the previous polarity of existentials, complemented by the chirality of spin, so that one has an electromagnetic charge, one has a magnetoelectric spin. Now something on a third level comes into play, which is so strange that it actually is called strangeness. So that any particle of an atomic structure will have three pairednesses. It will have charge, it will have spin, it will have strangeness. Each one of those involves a jump in energy and seems to be characteristic of the way in which the universe builds its way to the cosmos. The electron will jump in energy, 5.511 electron volts. It will jump to a new kind of electron called a muon. And the muon will jump to a third kind, first brought into play in 1983 by Leon Lederman and his group at the Fermi National Lab just west of Chicago, called the tau particle. And one finds again and again that not only are there like three levels, two jumps, but that this seems to be characteristic not only of the nature of the universe or the conscious universe, but has a quality that reveals that there are two major transformational thresholds. The first transformational threshold, the ancient way in Philo's time, because his teacher was Jesus. That's how he knew that the Logos is the cutter to make the jeweled person. Firsthand. His experience of Jesus' teaching is in a miraculously preserved book of his called On the Contemplative Life. In Greek, contemplation is theoria. We know it as theory, and theory is a form of contemplation. It is an applied form of contemplation that leads one through the prism of the contemplator, through the history, which is now a yoga of consciousness, a yoga of civilization. And through that seven-dimensional kaleidoscopic flow of the yoga of civilization, one is able to come to an analytic, an understanding, like a yoga would have, of any degree of specificity and exactness one would require. One can not only know with certainty, one can now know with perfection. And so nature in its cycle likes completeness. It likes that the integral can be brought to its oneness, to the universe. But the differential radiance of consciousness is that all possible worlds can be understood, even in their mysterious infinity. And we will see that one of the great developments from the Second World War into the 1960s was the realization that we had achieved such a refined consciousness of higher transforms of mathematics that the really effective mathematics of quantum physics showed everywhere infinities. How can one use it? How can one apply it? And so a whole process, and we'll get into it next week a little bit, was developed of how to do the close approximation of what would come out by leaving out the infinities and then doing what was called renormalization, bringing it back into ordinary physics, classic thermodynamics, etc. And one can get close enough as long as you make the umbria of it that this is the probability, not just a simple statistical probability, but a very refined quality. And one of the overwhelming qualities that has to be brought into the math is that one has to take angular momentum into serious participation and concern with what it is that you are able to understand, what answers to what questions you have. And that angular momentum is a way of expressing the chirality. When it comes to trying to bring, without the problem of the infinities being countered by the problematic renormalization, normal, even highly sophisticated math stutters. It isn't that it doesn't work so much, is that it gets into impasses of expressibility, so that one comes to a beautiful collection of essays by the great John Bell, Speakable and Unspeakable in Quantum Physics. We'll talk about J.S. Bell next week a little bit more. This is where computers enter in, and it isn't just the math that some genius can do. It's that with computers you can do higher math, higher, faster. And one of the great geniuses of this was Johnny von Neumann. And John von Neumann built the first working computer that was applied to mathematical problems, especially in physics and astronomy. It was called the differential calculator. Filled a room, and there were tables, long tables with dozens and dozens of rods with little connectors. And if you'd ever want to see the only photographs of differential analyzers that I'm familiar with were from a 1951 movie, a science fiction movie called When Worlds Collide. And I don't know, the critics and the government agencies at that time were not looking at science fiction films to be problems in the future, and there's a film clip of about 2 minutes of a differential analyzer from 1950 operating. Johnny von Neumann was one of the world's greatest mathematicians. And when he died prematurely, many of these men who worked at Los Alamos died in their 50s. Enrico Fermi, Johnny von Neumann, a number of them. His last 2 lectures from his hospital bed, his wife took down his dictation, and they were published as a little thin book called The Computer in the Brain. I'll bring a copy next week. What comes out of this kind of a play is that we are at a threshold now in the 21st century, by 2009 approaching 2010, where it is possible for the applications of science, for the kaleidoscopic recycling, overlapping, not just of history, but of history of science itself, history of history itself, history of mathematics, we have achieved a kaleidoscopic consciousness, which acts as a dimension that is very affine to the dimension of vision. That the quintessential and the seven, the septum essential, are related. They work together like experience and nature work together. Experience flows in nature. Kaleidoscopic consciousness, as the yoga of civilization, flows in the infinite field of vision. But to tune them, one needs an existentiality, but in the conscious mode. The existentiality in the natural mode, the Greek word for it is pragmatic. One has to not only know what to do, but how to do it exactly right repeatedly. One has, if you're going to do the dance, you have to know the steps, which means know how to work rhythm into motion, into posture, into participation, etc. Where existence requires a pragmatism to link nature with experience, what links visionary consciousness with kaleidoscopic consciousness is not pragmatic but prismatic. It is the jewel person. It is the spirit person who now has been shown by someone who knows how to cut the jewel out of the raw state, out of the natural cycle. Yes, complete, there it is. It's a raw diamond. Absolutely. Came from this core of this volcano in southern Africa, or the core of an ancient volcano in Arkansas, or one of the great diamond mines in the world is in upper New York State. It's owned by the Seneca Indian tribe. These are called Herkimer diamonds because they're double faceted. They can be cut in such a way that they have the points on both sides. I know this because the liaison with the Seneca Nation is my old friend who was one of the world's great scientists at Los Alamos, John Malusky, a true wizard. It is the ability to have a prismatic person linking the theoretical field with the history of what has happened before to produce the analytic of science, which is even more powerful than the integral of symbols, because it takes the integral of symbols and puts it into complementarity with the analytic of scientific consciousness about the cosmos. One is no longer just talking about the universe, however complete its integral. One is now talking perfection. The phrase in Sanskrit later on, after it was influenced by people sent to India, like St. Thomas, that created the great way, the Mahayana. Jesus' teaching was always called the way in his living lifetime. Never Christianity. It's called the way. The way, the Logos, cuts the jewel of the spirit person from the supposedly completed individuality by utilizing possibilities that were heretofore hidden in the character of the experience that was able to be brought through, not just the structure of the symbolic mind that would have considered it complete, but that there was a new dimension of transform that was happening that made the symbols transparent. so that they were not just there, but they were there in a transparent way so that one could say now, instead of closing the door, one had an open door. That transparent symbols became openings to that radiant world. And one of the great ways to express this, in 1989, The Challenge of an Open World, essays dedicated to Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. This was a follow-up because 4 years before, for the centenary of the birth of Niels Bohr, they brought together most of the sensitive world. The Challenge of Nuclear Armaments, essays dedicated to Niels Bohr and his appeal for an open world. And we'll understand that just this past week, President Obama was in Russia talking with President Medvedev and with Vladimir Putin of the need for the United States and for Russia to pair together, because nuclear armaments are again slipping outside of the ability for even wild prediction into a chaos once characterized by Bertrand Russell. He was a nonagenarian at the time. He lived to be 97. He stood up in front of a group of us and said, with his scrawny, old voice wavering, "Man has never made a weapon that he has not used." We cannot change that, so we have to change man. We have to recut man in a way that he is not limited to what he has done before. He must learn anew how to do what was never done before. Let's come back to something we started before the break. Coming to volume 1 of the collected works of Niels Bohr. It's in 10 volumes like this. His biographer at the beginning of this first volume is talking about the incredible development that just as Niels Bohr was invited to go to the United States in 1938, to go to one of the most powerful places in the world, because Bohr's Institute of Theoretical Physics in Copenhagen was one of the most powerful places in the world. And one of the few places that was almost on a par with it was at Princeton, the Institute of Advanced Studies. Because at the Institute of Advanced Studies was where Albert Einstein had hung out since 1931. And because Einstein, not like Bohr of being masterful at bringing young men especially into the jewel possibilities of a very high radiant consciousness in math, in physics, in astronomy, but Einstein was that other kind of a teacher. His presence alone sent out a vibe that all things are possible, and that with patience and pacing, one can have that once in a millennium insight flash. And if you are open, you will be able to remember, instead of it just being a flash of insight and then you hope you can work it out, you have it in an indelible seed instant that can be then translated into a visionary field of infinity that allows for the prism to recalibrate all of its prisms at the same time, instantly. Einstein was one of those kinds of teachers who prepared you by generating the quintessence of the situation, so that if you were being prismatically made into a jewel, if you understood the historical kaleidoscopic flow of things, the scientific analytic moment would link the theoretical insight into a way of expressing it in the art language of higher math, in the process of making a new possibility where there had never been before in the historical flow, complex flow, and would record as a way then of making an experiment that the results of which will give you the accuracy in an analytic that will hold in the cosmos, not just in the universe, not just in the idea of a universe, but in the infinite field of expanded scalar that we now would be able to call reality. Not just completeness, but perfection and completeness together in a complementarity that yields the real. Here, just as soon as Niels Bohr got on the ship, right after New Year's Day, 1939, coming to Princeton, coming to the United States, word came that a brilliant female physicist, Lise Meitner, and her nephew, Max Frisch, had come to understand here is a definite theoretical possibility of splitting the atom. The atom of uranium, but not, as we said before the break, not the normal, though rare in itself, uranium-238, but a rarer yet isotope, uranium-235. Because to split uranium-238 requires incredible astronomical energy. But to split U-235 requires a slow neutron, which had only recently been discovered in 1932. So all of this is just a handful of years. Here's the way it reads in Volume 1, just a few paragraphs of the collected works of Niels Bohr. The first experiments actually showing the emission of the fragments were performed in Copenhagen by Frisch in January 1939. By then, Bohr had left for Princeton, where he had been invited to spend a few months. It was just on his departure that he had heard of Frisch's idea and project of experiment during the voyage, and certainly just shortly after his arrival. In the same month of January 1939, he outlined the whole theory of the process. In the following months, this theory was refined and elaborated in great detail thanks to Wheeler's collaboration, John A. Wheeler. John A. Wheeler, I think he may still be alive. He's almost 100 years old. He was one of those brilliant geniuses at Princeton in the 30s who benefited from the vibe of Einstein. But Wheeler was very much like a Niels Bohr, Papa Bohr character. He loved enthusing young students to become better than him, and his prayers were answered. Like Niels Bohr's great teacher, Ernest Rutherford, who had had his great teacher of J.J. Thomson. Thomson found Rutherford to be the special student. Rutherford found Bohr to be the special student. Einstein had found Wheeler to be the special student, And John A. Wheeler found Richard Feynman to be the special student. And it was Feynman in the 1940s, at the end of this decade, who found that the limitations of mathematics as a language, no matter how complex the transforms were, they could not speak real. So he developed Feynman diagrams, which are universally used today. That when you cannot speak about it, even mathematically, on the highest levels, there is a way to non-speakable communicate what it is that is happening and why, and to express it so that one can now make experiments, even though the infinities are included, but especially because the infinities are included. Because in nature, for existentiality to occur, there must be spaces between the particles. There must be spaces between the atoms, however minute, however fleeting, between the ones or zeros. Otherwise, they would not be quanta. You couldn't quantize them. Whereas in the conscious, prismatic, historical cosmos, infinity is in between. Not between the quanta, but in between the possibilities. So that one now has to learn, and we will talk about this next week, how the great realization of complementarity was that one has to work keeping in mind the zeros, but keeping the harmonic analysis with the infinities. That they are not problems. It's not problematic. It's prismatic. And in order to have a supersymmetry of zeros and infinities, now one is able to talk real without saying words sometimes. More next week.